1,665 people, virtually every Cherokee in the East.
There were some sheets that were blue, some were white, some were almost orange, some were long, some were wide. And they sewed those all together in a scroll. And if you laid those out, they'd be over 160 feet long. And John Ross had prepared for one of the Cherokee's friends in the Senate to place that upon the table in the Senate, that protest, so they would reconsider the execution of that treaty. And before that senator could present it, a congressman from Kentucky and one from Maine had a duel, and one killed the other. And Congress adjourned.
While a frustrated John Ross waited out the congressional recess that followed the killing, he wrote home to his sister-in-law. As soon as they bury their illustrious brother, Congress can get back to the business of dealing with us savages. Congress, however, did not circle back to Chief Ross's petition. It was simply pushed aside. The Cherokee people's near-unanimous plea never received the consideration of the United States Senate. On the morning of May 26, 1838, 3 days after the removal deadline, federal troops and state militia began what they called the Assembly of the Cherokee people.
Everything that wasn't actually on the person now belonged to the state. And they were forced out into yards and on to the roads with whatever they had on their back. Come on, Reverend, get them moving.
There were staging areas around the Cherokee Nation with wooden stockades. And the people were herded into what were literally cattle pens.
Come on, keep moving.
A few weeks after the roundup began, the first detachments of Cherokees were shipped west under military guard. Word quickly got back to the stockades. Drought and summer disease had made the trip a march of death. Chief Ross was frantic to avoid further loss. He convinced U.S. military officials to let him take over the organization and supply of removal, and to let his people sit tight until fall, after the season of disease had passed. A few hundred Cherokees who agreed to renounce tribal citizenship were allowed to remain on their farms in North Carolina. The rest, more than 12,000 captive Cherokees, waited in the fetid stockades. Prisoners, one missionary remembered, were obliged to lie at night on the naked ground, in the open air, exposed to wind and rain. And in this way, many are hastening to a premature grave. Half the infants and all the aged have died directly, and 1/4 of the remainder. Through June, July, August, and September, they waited, until, at the beginning of October, the Cherokee Nation was finally pushed west. It was early December before the final group began the 850-mile trip. By then, the long line of Cherokee travelers stretched from Illinois into Kentucky, unbroken in places for 3 miles. John Ross had seen that the detachments were well supplied for the 3 to 4 month trek. But winter storms made the Mississippi and Ohio rivers impassable, stranding thousands for a full month.
No one could have predicted that one of the hardest winters in memory would strike that year. When they reached the Mississippi River, the river was frozen. There were 3 different detachments trapped between the Mississippi and another river frozen behind them. And there they sat for weeks in deep, deep snow and ice.
As long as they were moving, maybe it wasn't so bad, but when you actually had to wait for the ice and sit there, and maybe you're sleeping on snow, but you're probably sleeping on melted mud, and you're sick, your baby's sick, your grandmother's sick, and there's nothing you can do about it.
The harsh weather so slowed progress that supplies of dried corn and salt pork began to run short. When white settlers along the road recognized the Cherokees' need, a few offered help. Others took the opportunity to cash in on the woe, charging wildly inflated prices for grain. Cherokee men were soon too depleted to hunt wild game. A New Englander passing through western Kentucky noted the sad procession. 2,000 people, sick and feeble, many near death. One woman was carrying her youngest child who was dying in her arms. Multitudes go on foot. Even aged females were traveling with heavy burdens attached to their back, on sometimes frozen ground, with no covering for the feet except what nature had given them. The Indians buried 14 or 15 at every stopping place.
Because of the Civilization Project, a great many of those coming on the trail were Christians. And a lot of times on the trail, they would sing Christian hymns. Here, these thousands of people making this forced march, 1/4 of them dying en route. And they're singing, "Guide me, O thou great Jehovah, guide me, God. Pilgrim that I am in this barren land. I am weak, and you are mighty. Guide us."
The United States gained a lot of land and farms and taverns and ferries and things like that. But a loss for the American government is the blemish, the stain it places upon our national honor. What we did in the 1830s to the southeastern Indians, it's ethnic cleansing.
The removal had caused the deaths of some 4,000 people. Someone had to answer for that. Someone had to answer for those lives. A life taken in that way must be balanced out.
They stabbed him repeatedly. They beat him, took turns kicking the body and jumping up and down, caving in his chest.
And the same morning, 4 men came to Elias Boudinot and asked for medicine. And as he turned to greet the people, he was stabbed. And another used a hatchet to the head. Major Ridge was shot 5 times, and he was killed. 3 murders in the same day. 3 outstanding people, the Cherokee people, you know, we lost them. Brilliant minds that day. And I think it was a loss for the whole nation.
There was no easy balm for the wounds caused by removal. Angry talk, bitter accusation, and violent reprisal flared among the Cherokees for the next 30 years. It fell to John Ross, who retained the office of Principal Chief, to heal his nation, to realize the dream he and the Ridges had always shared, the continuation of a strong and sovereign Cherokee nation. By 1860, after a